begin our meeting of the MPO for November 28th. And first on our agenda is matters from the public. Is there anyone who would like to address us on anything at this time? No one is coming up, so we will skip over that. And any responses? Are there any changes that we need to, things we need to add to the agenda? I see none, so we will charge on through that. Approval of the meeting minutes from October 25th. I'm sorry, I was absent. Did anyone have a chance to read them and or correct them or make a motion?
I just have one comment.
Okay.
I noticed I'm noted as UVA Parking and Transportation, but I'm actually UVA Office of
No, that's good. Any other corrections or additions? Do we have a motion on the minutes?
Move to approve the minutes as modified.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Is there more discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Very good. These minutes are adopted. Zooming on, 2045 Long Range Transportation Plan with Wood. Thank you, sir.
All right.
Fun.
I'm going to run through a little bit of an update, then we can jump into kind of the meat and potatoes of the discussion. Background on the plan, again, plan will have a constrained list and a visioning list for each project category. So this is related to the funding discussion we've had at previous meetings. Funding is broken out into, funding forecasts, are broken out into roadway, bridges, intersections, and bike ped. With the smart scale process, the constrained list acts as our regional priorities list in essence. That's just kind of important to define the relationship between what we're doing now and kind of how it's evolved because of smart scale. 6-year plan, which is our TIP and the state's STIP, is also included in the long range transportation plan, and that's kind of what aligns us with what's the difference between short and medium range and long range, and that's why I have that up there to remind folks of that. So our plan year for the projects we're discussing starts when the TIP ends, which is year 6.
6-year plan.
6 years, yeah.
When the 6-year plan ends. The TIP is only a 4-year plan.
Thank you, excuse me.
So it's basically when the 6-year plan ends through 2045.
All right. Just overview where we are still in the process is working through step 5, which is evaluating projects in scenarios. We're hoping to narrow that down and start transitioning into step 6 and then step 7, which is constraining based on the dollars available. Wanted to kind of touch on the constraining process. This is something that we've previously touched on, but really didn't have a good visual to kind of illustrate it. So we have kind of the regional needs analysis, which is kind of identifying where we are seeing our potential issues based on the information that we have about our transportation network. Projects kind of get divided up into the roadway category, which is mainly what we have been discussing up until this point. Intersections, which is driven by taking a look at data that VDOT provides in terms of intersection efficiency related to safety. Bridge needs, which is, again, a data set provided by VDOT, which is just looking at the overall condition of the bridges on our primary routes and which ones potentially would need to be teed up for rehabilitation and replacement. The bike ped recommendations, which are coming out of the Jefferson Area Regional Bike and Pedestrian Plan, which is an item on the agenda for later. And then a note about transit operating amount, which is about $95 million, and that's from the discussions we've had, seems to be something that will probably stay level, but we don't really constrain the transit projects. So they're kind of separate, but also in this plan, just as a footnote. Same slide that we've had for several meetings, the estimated future funding, kind of linking all into the scenarios now. We'll see that as we go through the discussion.
I can realize it's in the body.
Yeah, bike ped is estimated as its own bucket. And it should be noted that many of the roadway projects include bike and pedestrian elements. I think the vast majority of them that are on the list include some sort of bike and pedestrian element.
So I'm probably jumping ahead and out of order here, but
No,
something like hydraulic, where it has bike and ped as an intersection and it's a smart scale, does it get some of those 3 buckets in order to be able to possibly be afforded? Otherwise, it takes all of our money for 20 years and we don't get to do anything else. How do we do that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and no.
Yes is
I mean,
good.
the way we set this up is we looked at the different funding sources that were identified in the tip, and we created these groups based on the revenues that were highlighted in the tip, because we had these 4 groups in the tip. So basically, intersections was the safety ITS group, the bike ped was the enhancement group, the bridge was its own group, and then everything else was roadway. But if you look in the tip, a lot of projects that are funded in our group in the safety ITS group. So I think there's some flexibility here as to how we do funding. It's just making sure that we understand that going in. And we could do that. Because otherwise you may want to do if for some reason the hydraulic project doesn't get funded, you can still have the bike ped stuff get funded separately.
And a footnote being that this is simply an estimation of what we could expect in funding. This is not a limit to the amount of funding that we can receive, because the smart scale process is now a competitive process. So we could have a project like hydraulic receive 100% of its funding, and that would then change our forecasts. In the previous LRTP processes, there was kind of a estimation was made, and that was kind of the assumptions that were used. But with Smart Scale, we've gone to this competitive process. So if a project can potentially compete, it can get funded. It's not this is not limiting in terms of receiving money to construct a project if it's advanced through the Smart Scale process, if that makes sense. So this is a federal requirement. We have to continue to do this to meet the standards of MPO planning for the Fed, for USDOT. Virginia now uses a new process to allocate state and federal transportation dollars that is not necessarily aligned with the old way. There's no compliancy issue or anything like that. It just happens that there's the way they allocate the dollars in Virginia is competitively.
And is the bridge bucket for any special size of bridge, or can it be a secondary road bridge and a new connection, or maintenance?
It has to be eligible for funding,
okay.
for construction funding, not maintenance. And those have been identified, and that's where that list comes from.
So is the Lincoln Bridge one of those that's identified?
I don't think so. I think it's the bridges in the city.
Eastern Avenue is the number R13, so that's basically all what Eastern Avenue is.
We have
I don't know if we have them all identified yet, but
Okay.
I mean, what usually happens is I get the list from the bridge section district.
So is that the
It has a
Belmont
list of
Bridge?
projects, and those are ones that are sitting.
Belmont Bridge is not included.
Because that's a previous
It
generation.
already has allocations
Right,
on
okay.
it. These are all
But that's
new.
the type of project.
Yes, or the bridge at JPA,
Okay,
things like that,
Got it, okay.
Funded through that revenue stream.
I mean, I think, let's see, there's the bridge on Shadwell Creek. I think this one is, there's a bunch of bridges that are on that list currently. And those are what we use to fund them, because I usually get cost estimates from this bridge section on what it's going to cost to fix those bridges.
Because you said it wasn't maintenance, so this is, that's why I was asking.
This isn't
Newer.
maintenance, this is construction.
or replacement is the other thing you're pointing
Okay.
out.
or replacement.
Okay, well, Kevin, please help us chase that Lincoln Hall Bridge with this, because we need $5 million to do that real quick. Okay. Super. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so kind of jumping forward, same slide that we saw in October, just kind of outlining the scenario process with the rounds of evaluation. Today we're going to be discussing the results of the round 2 evaluation and then providing input on a possible round 3. A reminder of kind of the list of projects that we started this process with. And kind of the footnote again is these were those projects that are feeding into this roadway category.
Your mouse isn't showing.
Oh, my mouse is not showing.
But yeah, at the top.
You can see it on my screen. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Right. So we discussed the results of round 1 at our regularly scheduled meeting and the October meeting. We discussed scenario 2, which includes D and E. The colors on the bottom of the list identify the projects that are different in those 2 lists. And so I'm going to turn things over to Jacob. He's going to run through the results.
You can actually stay here for now. So yeah, we will be looking at the results of the many different scenarios. And so in looking at those results, it's important to kind of understand what projects are included in scenarios D and E here. So a lot of the projects are the same between scenario D and scenario E. Then the unique projects to scenario D are the Hillsdale Drive to Rio connection, the Route 20 multimodal project, the Sunset Fontaine connector, and the South Pantops Drive bridge. So a number of these were originally identified as kind of referred to as connectivity projects, creating new roadway connections, as well as Route 20, which is a multimodal project, which could include intersection improvements and would definitely include bicycle and pedestrian improvements. So those are the 4 projects, and yeah, if you have the sheet from your packet that has this, it'd be helpful to have in front of you looking ahead. And then scenario E is the US 250 Shadwell, widening of US 250, that's east of I-64, and the US 250 Free Bridge widening. So widening Free Bridge and the adjacent areas to increase vehicle capacity or vehicle throughput through there. So yeah, that's scenario D and E, and then we had previously identified scenarios A, B, and C and looked at some of that information before. So this we provided again in the packet. It's just kind of the detailed explanation of what the different pieces of this scenario evaluation mean. So I will actually kind of be going through some of these in the context of the bar charts that we've been showing. So if you want to move on. So yeah, this is something that I know we looked at last time with just scenarios A, B, and C, and there was some concern about how to interpret it as a whole. So we're going to look at each individual piece of this, just kind of refer to what the, what values go into this, so that we can get a little better sense of what that means. So yeah, as we dig into that, a reminder, scenario A was the original capacity scenario where we took every project that would increase vehicle capacity, or where that was the primary purpose, and included that in one scenario. Scenario B was the connectivity scenario, where we took all the projects that would provide new links or new roadway connections, connectivity, and scenario C was multimodal, which included all the transit projects and also all of the roadway projects where a lot of the benefit would be to bicycles and pedestrians, the multimodal projects. So those were kind of our benchmarks in these graphics to say, okay, if all the money goes, toward this type of project, this will be the result. So as we go through each of these different measures, you can kind of look at scenario D and E in the context of scenarios A, B, and C. So starting with the first measure, resident access to transit, this includes the number of people within a quarter mile of a transit stop, and also has a somewhat complicated factor of the headway time. You know, giving more value if that number of people is served by a route that runs more often than every 20 minutes, and so on. And then also adds the number of people of disadvantaged populations. That's poverty, people in poverty, people who are minority, people who are 65, older than 65, and people who have limited English proficiency. So all of that information is captured in the bars that you see on the resident access to transit measure there. So you can see scenario A and B aren't even showing up because there were no transit projects included in scenarios A and B. But scenario C had transit projects, and then scenario D and E have identical transit projects to each other. So you can see that scenario D and E both have the same improvement in this measure, and it's just slightly less than scenario C, because between round 1 and round 2, we identified that the Fontaine Research Park bus route that was included in scenario C, the fact that is intended to be done by UVA anyway means that it does not need to be included in the LRTP process. So that was removed and shows this slight decrease between scenario C and
So what does the
scenario D.
5% mean?
So that's where I think it's probably helpful to not focus on those numbers. What it means is at the end of this, we'll kind of show the graphic or the table, and it's included in your packet, that just has all the numbers. So, you know, that previous table showed what all these measures mean, what they include. So over here, number of people that are within a quarter mile and those adjustments, that came up with an actual number that was first calculated for 2045 if there was no transit improvements, no improvements at all. All the projects we're looking at, we said if we didn't do any of them, we would have a 2045 no-build scenario. So the 5% line means that all three of these scenarios would improve over the no-build by, it looks like a little over 5%. So yeah, that you know, amount there is meant to give you some sense and to show kind of how these graphics relate to the actual numbers. But as far as interpreting these graphics, it's more helpful to look at one scenario compared to the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it just that it was there and it was distracting, so.
Yeah, that's a very good clarification. So the next measure, and I'll try to go through these a little bit quicker so we can look at the big picture, but this is looking at reduction in vehicle commute time. So this looks at the average commute time driving across the whole system. And the graphic there, you can see that original scenario A, capacity scenario, had the largest improvement. So in this case, everything going to the right is an improvement. The largest improvement in reducing vehicle commute time. And you can see that our new scenarios, D and E, also produce a notable improvement in the vehicle commute time, as shown by the model. Moving on to access to mode transfers, this looks at the number of park and ride spaces and the number of bike racks at transit stops throughout the region. And you can see this graph looks similar to the first one in scenarios D and E having equal values and slightly less than scenario C. So moving on to the economic development and land use measures. The first is regarding multimodal activity centers. So this looks at the number of transit stops that are in the identified activity center, transportation analysis zones or TAZs, and the length of bicycle and pedestrian facilities in the activity center TAZs. So here you can see that scenario D is slightly has slightly less impact than scenario C, and scenario E is just slightly less than scenario D, but all quite similar. Then looking at activity center road miles, this is the length of roads within or adjacent to these activity center TAZs. Here you can see our original connectivity scenario, scenario B, had the most impact of any, most improvement of any scenario. But scenario D, the recent scenario D, had a very similar impact, and scenario E would have somewhat less impact, but still would increase the length of roadway, within or adjacent to the activity center TAZs. And then finally in this category is network efficiency, which measures efficiency in terms of the regional vehicle miles traveled per capita. So trying to reduce the vehicle miles traveled per capita in the region. And here, looking at scenarios D and E, they both improve this measure, with scenario D improving this measure more than any of the other scenarios that have been identified. Okay, if there aren't any questions there, we'll move on to safety. This measures expected crashes based on volume and some other model parameters. So this doesn't take into account if there are intersection improvements at a certain location, that those would certainly have safety benefits. This is just using the travel demand model and the different parameters that it uses to identify, potential improvements or worsening of conditions for safety.
Does safety also include access for fire and rescue to get across rivers, creeks, and railroad tracks?
It does not. No,
Because that certainly is an important element of safety when you have the road built on both sides and you need the bridge in the middle.
Yeah, that's not, this is just, a measure to attempt to look at in the ways that we can the number of crashes or the amount of,
vehicle collisions.
Correct. So no, it does not take into account something like that. And then also in this category is the bicycle and pedestrian network, which looks at the length of shared use paths and bike lanes and the length of shared use paths and regional sidewalks. And here you can see that scenarios D and E perform quite similarly and are actually slightly improved, slightly better than scenario E, the original multimodal scenario. If there are no questions, we'll continue on to congestion. So we have one measure here, congestion mitigation, which uses the travel demand model to estimate the network-wide hours of vehicle delay. So unsurprisingly, the scenario A, capacity projects, showed the most notable increase, or improvement, I should say, in this measure. And scenarios D and E both show more improvement than scenario B did, the connectivity scenario, and so do show notable improvement in this measure. And finally, the environment category and the transit and non-motorized commute mode share measure. This looks at the percent, so looking at the travel demand model, the percent of regional trips that are non-motorized and the percent of regional trips that are using transit. And this shows scenario D doing better than any other scenario. Scenario C also showed an improvement, and scenario E did also, but with a lesser, to a lesser extent.
So is there a way that you can, I'm just thinking in terms of how we do things in GIS, can you take all the data that fit into these and stack them all up and see which one overall scores the best in the positive direction and
Well, we have to, otherwise this is meaningless, so I mean, seeing them individually doesn't help me, unfortunately, because we can't do all of our eggs in one basket.
So, I mean, to try to answer that question, we have all the numbers in one place, but trying to evaluate multiple things at the same time and, add them together, it would be quite complicated to try to come up with, some sort of weighting system to say, okay, we're going to take this improvement and weight it by this and then add them all together. So really we are just presenting these kind of all at once, both in numeric form and then next in that overall graphic to say, and we'll have our own kind of conclusions or what we see when comparing D and E. But yeah, this is all kind of informational as far as what, this evaluation process can show us, but it isn't going to provide us, final answers on any individual projects. So, yeah, I mean, that's how Smart Scale works, is to have this complicated evaluation process, and I think Chuck can say he's glad we're not doing exactly what Smart Scale is, Chuck and Tiffany, because that takes months and months of evaluation, all sorts of issues, and so we've done a lot of evaluation here, but yes, it won't come down to one final number. It will be these tables and, yeah, if you want to look at the next graph, showing it all at once to see. So in looking at scenarios D and E, there's actually a fairly clear picture. Yeah, we can go back to this is good for now. We'll list the takeaways and then we can maybe look at them again here. But yeah, scenario D actually scored better than scenario E in all ways except congestion mitigation and commute time. So looking at activity center road miles, VMT per capita, mode share, safety, scenario D was showing notably better results in those ways, and was showing similar results to scenario E in congestion mitigation and commute time. So our main takeaway, and we'd be glad, this is a topic of conversation, is that these results indicate that the multiple connectivity projects that are part of scenario D have many positive impacts with only slightly less congestion mitigation compared to the scenario E projects that were unique to scenario E. So if you want to go back to the last slide. Is that helpful? I mean, I know it doesn't provide an answer as far as this is the perfect scenario or these are the perfect projects, but that's our takeaway from this.
I guess, so if we're looking at the scenario D, round 2, in the attachment A, and there are the 4 unique projects added to scenario D, that means those 4 projects are worthy still of consideration, as opposed to scenario E where the 2 that were unique are not?
I wouldn't go that far. I would say that, in aggregate, those 4 projects provided more benefits compared to those other 2 projects. Okay. But I don't think we're not indicating that you should, say, okay, these 4 are great, these 2 are not. More just kind of a general, that scenario did better. That type of project might be, more valuable. That's great. So, the next discussion would be digging into the more specific projects and just looking at how to move forward here. So we can come back to these results if you have any need to, but can also move forward to discuss specific projects.
Move on and see how we do.
So, I mean, I guess I was maybe saying the whole holistically, because I'm just not sure then if what we just were presented doesn't help us how to identify projects to support.
I think it can be used to explain why we chose the things we wanted to choose, but we still have to go through and choose the ones we want.
Yeah.
Because this does not give us 1 from column A, 2 from column B to make something that works well. And just like the city's gonna have to pick amongst the city projects that get the highest priority, I think the county needs to be able to have a chance to choose between a $30 million bridge here and a $10 million bridge there as far as what comes first. I don't know why things were moved to the vision list. I guess that was done at the meeting. I was absent at, so I'll have to chase that some other time. But when projects have been in the secondary road plan since 2004, just say, never mind. When 5,000 houses are built on either side of this creek right into the bridge to be built, you can't just say never mind. So we'll have to figure that out.
So with the results of scenario D and E in mind, we discussed with our technical committee how we should move forward in creating a next scenario for analysis. And based on their input, we kind of came up with this draft recommendation to go as a starting point for today's discussion on getting some guidance from you all on what we should be looking at in terms of our next step for evaluation of projects. You'll notice that I've included the high-level planning cost estimates on all of the projects. This was a request at our last meeting, I believe. Anne was interested in that information because when we're told we have to constrain, cost is an extremely important factor in figuring out what we potentially could afford in terms of priority projects. I got a footnoted here that the top 4 projects there are pending smart scale applications, and depending on those projects' performance, that has the potential to have a significant impact on the total dollar amount of whatever constrained scenario we are looking at. We're hoping that there will be some indication of how things will shake out in January. And that will add a lot of clarity in terms of how much money we're dealing with and how much money we can potentially constrain. Because once a project is funded through Smart Scale, it goes onto that 6-year plan list and is not affecting our available funding estimates at that point.
So
So
how
that
is,
frees up money. Sorry. Just
But
to clarify.
right now, these projects are unfunded, so they have to remain, they have to be considered and planned as if they were in a scenario and all of that.
But if they're in Smart Scale, it's a different bucket.
Once the CTV allocates funding, they go into the 6-year plan bucket, and that doesn't affect our potential 20-year funding. Granted, we will revise our funding estimates based on that round 3 result to hopefully adjust that pie chart in a positive direction.
One point
I
to
need
note
to go
is
back to
that the West Main Street project, it's only part of it funded. That's not the whole project. That's only the part east of the railroad tracks. Part west of the railroad tracks, that would be separate.
Right.
The city's
yeah, we have
20 million.
So we'd have to show that as possibly as 2 projects. One of them that might be funded or will be funded probably this time, and the other one that will have to be submitted as in a later round.
So my question is, what is the difference between R5, which is the US 250 free bridge widening, and R20, which is the free bridge area capacity evaluation?
That is
And that evaluation is 40 million versus 39. And then why was the South Pantons Drive Bridge R19 replaced by R20 when it's less money than R20?
That is an excellent question, and that was based on a recommendation from the technical committee. Staff at that meeting indicated that they would like the policy board to consider replacing those 2 projects with something that would be more focused on making intersection improvements, possibly on US 250, and considering a a alternative crossing that might be limited to bike and pedestrian and transit only. So staff have included that recommendation as discussed at the technical committee meeting for the policy board's consideration. And this is a copy of the motion that was made at the technical committee meeting. And it's a direct quote, so. Yeah.
So
It's a direct
funding
quote.
for a study.
Not for $40 million.
It would, it could be a study. The $40 million represents an estimate of how much it may cost to try to do a bridge and intersection improvements.
So if we were to include it as R20 in our evaluation, we would need to say what it would entail, you know, to come up with a cost estimate and to come up with the benefits of the project.
Transit, bike, and ped bridge only.
So what's being, you know, suggested is to study and identify what exactly could be done, but in the meantime, or in order to potentially include as a constrained item,
You need to.
yeah, a more specific possibility has been indicated here other than a study, which is to say a multimodal bridge, bicycle and pedestrian transit, and then improvements at the intersections on
So
both sides.
the bridge would allow
Bridge.
buses,
Yes.
but no single occupant vehicles.
That is what the technical committee suggested could be an option. There's the opportunity to indicate a project be for study only. That is a possibility if something like this is not ready for prime time or not a priority, is a regional project. That is a possibility, and we've done that in previous long-range transportation plans. For example, the hydraulic area was identified as a study in the 2040.
I just want to understand this. So if you had the South Pantox Drive Bridge, which was a multimodal bridge, you would be funding a project to do the multimodal functioning that the study is doing for more money.
The cost is to understand.
This basically project includes some of the improvements of the 250 corridor study and the connectivity of the bridge, South Pantox Bridge. So you're going to basically get both in this. You're just not going to have vehicles using the Pantox Bridge. They would still use the regular bridge, but you're going to have the intersection improvements of the 250 project, which weren't included in the Pantox project. So you're
Just help me figure out, how could you really exclude vehicles, single occupant vehicles from that bridge?
We'd have to work that details out.
Buses push the button and the bottom.
Well, I can understand the jumping,
Yeah.
the intersections,
Yeah.
but that doesn't include cars from crossing.
There's methods you can use to restrict it.
Huge signs and enforcement.
It's just
Just
a lot of money
initial
to
thought,
allow.
It just seems like, then how's it dealing with congestion on 250?
Well, the intersection improvements are dealing with congestion. You're still having to run the buses through that corridor. If you take the buses out of the
So is this
corridor,
trying to almost be like a BRT line? So
Well,
that all of
it's
South
just getting
Pantox would
the-
be bus only?
it's just getting the buses across
That's
the
not
river, which is the pinch point. So it allows better transit operation through that area because they can get across without having to wait through the signals on 250.
What do you think, Brian?
UVA, you have the arms that come down for Cormac.
Yeah.
There's
Managed.
transponders that they have installed to allow for that access to be restricted at certain times of day, so.
At certain times of day?
Yeah, but I mean, they could set it up so it's all the time if they want to, the buses could come and go, as
Yeah,
well
the
as
idea
staff.
is to prioritize the
I'm all about prioritizing the
and bike
buses
transit, yeah.
and the bike ped, but I just can't, I have never seen anything that just restricts the cars. And then is that then setting this up for failure for future funding?
That is a question.
That was the discussion we had it.
One thing that did come up at the technical committee meeting is maybe that project would be eligible for FDA funding for innovation or something like that, which John Jones mentioned as a possible funding source for something like this. But there's been no further analysis of that as a possible funding source, so we wouldn't be able to say if that's valuable or not.
What was I think we're just trying to understand what the basis of their recommendation was. Was this something that they put some study into and they have a good understanding of, or not?
No, this was based on local staff. Does
Is
Mr.
there any
McDermott,
staff there?
Mr. McDermott is a representative from?
Isn't that, I'm the,
Please come,
You
speaker.
can see
So
the speaker.
so I am on the technical committee, and I was part of this discussion. So first of all, I think I just wanna
Vice Chair.
make sure you understand that that the reason we were looking for a study is because at the time there were two projects that seemed to achieve the exact same thing, which were the Free Bridge improvements and a South Pantops Bridge that we were both evaluating through this process to try and maybe determine which one would be best, but we didn't know. So the idea was we need to figure out, do we do one? Do we do both? Do we pick another location? We need to figure out what project is best to move to the top of the list, to our recommended list. And whatever that decision is fine with us. There have been multiple studies that looked at it, and they all come up with different ideas. So what we asked for was, because at one point in time there was a recommendation to have a transit-only connection across where South Pantops Drive is. We thought that should be part of what we looked at here. The idea being that we have some nodal development that we look to occur in the Pantops area in the future, and we thought with land use changes that rapid transit, not a full rapid transit system, but a more rapid transit that could serve those and serve downtown, serve all the employment areas out there would be effective. We are not recommending this, but we would like it to be evaluated to see if that's an effective option. Or if it's not an effective option, let's just go back to the idea of widening Free Bridge, which was a recommendation from 2 years ago from the MPO. But we just would like to put some effort into evaluating what is our best option out there.
So if I can ask, so then having the South Pantops Drive Bridge though, you would still be evaluating the possibility of vehicular traffic, single occupant vehicles crossing that bridge. It's not, because the way that's written, it's like only transit bike ped bridge. And I don't know how you can make that call without evaluating it first.
I think that was my understanding from that, was that we want to look at all options, including transit bike ped only, or vehicular, and also not any bridge there, or just the transit bike ped bridge there, and widening Free Bridge. Take a look at all the options that are put on the table, find out what's best, and try and move forward with it.
And even to the possibility that you would do improvements to both, you'd have a new bridge and you'd improve the Free Bridge.
I think it's a possibility. I mean, I think something like that would have to be phased in, because we can't get them both at once because of cost.
But it's interesting how no other project, I guess hydraulic got studied. And not a lot of them don't. Okay, well thank you, that helps a lot.
Thank you. Over the years, a lot of them have been studied.
What would be the difference between that study and the Free Bridge study that was done a few years ago, looking at the grant?
That's a good question. I think
Because
potentially.
that's basically R5.
Yeah.
Which what came out of that study, so what's changed that would change that recommendation?
The only thing that I would say has changed is maybe the availability of new data and some more refined tools to understand current conditions in that area. I'm thinking of things like the possibility of using the streetlight tool to understand maybe where trips are coming from and going to that are crossing Free Bridge. But none of that is going to really change the fact that there probably needs to be some sort of capacity improvement in that area if we want to address peak time congestion in that area.
At one point, where in the process does the local jurisdiction decide that they're going to support something? Because I know the city was very strong a few years ago to say no, hell no on what was proposed for Free Bridge. So we need to find out those decisions first before a whole lot more time is spent on something that is not supported by the locality. So I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's important that we not, number one, tie up lots of millions of dollars for something that's not going to go anywhere in our planning process. That just throws everything else down the drain. But also to put staff and everybody into a whirlwind on something that has been pretty directly told was not supported. So if that's changed, that's great. And you
we have to
time
have that conversation
to
with council because this is the
staff is very
council.
strong. Your staff was very strong about that before. So I just don't, I
Really
don't know.
started with the Free Bridge, I think,
Yeah,
the
just
South
the widening up the street.
Our public was extremely opposed to it.
Well, no, that may be why, and if that hasn't changed, then that should be recognized as a fact, that's all. I just want to know, have everybody brought up to date, or at least the decision makers need to get themselves up to date on what the reality is, so that we don't do that.
I guess as a process question with the MPO, I mean, before we make a final decision, do we both go back to our respective bodies and ask them to go over this list? I don't think so.
John, is it, Ken might know the answer too, I seem to recall it's a requirement of the comp plans to reflect or agree with the 6-year plan redone?
No, not
Exactly,
exactly, it's a
the
different time
The
frame.
long range plan.
So, but you would have to, for it to get into this 6-year plan, it would have to be in the comp.
Yeah, right, and that's where, I thought it was the other way around though. I thought comp plan had to agree with the 6-year plan. I thought it was very top down.
Well, I mean,
it starts at the bottom because you feed from the MPO, the long range plan up to the 6-year plan, but then coming back down. But
well, I mean, the long range plan is just a planning tool for where you want funds to go.
Right.
And the 6-year plan applies funds to particular projects. So, but again, if you happen to get with Smart Scale, it has to be in the comp plan before you can apply for it. But let's just say somewhere money fell from the sky and you had a project that wasn't in your comp plan and you suddenly had federal dollars for it, you'd have to put it in your comp plan each year.
so part of the risk of not doing what you're wanting to do, Kathy, and make sure there is local agreement is that if you let something just work its way up, then eventually the localities don't agree with it, could be a point to where that's not a good thing for at the state level.
Well, but maybe the difference is, for instance, when there was, public opposition to that project, it was kind of when that project was studied specifically, right? Versus we're looking at a whole set of projects here, which is sort of a different process. As far as I know, in the past, when we've gone through this, I don't think we went through a step with the localities. I mean, I think the thinking is that the localities are at this table.
And, there's a high degree of comfort knowing, our respective bodies and planning commissions did approve the hydraulic small area plan. They know that very well. Our city knows about the West Main Street multimodal plan very well. The others, are kind of, we're relying on technical expertise. to advise us as being the representatives of our bodies to make these decisions. But I do know the Free Bridge that capacity issue is huge. We keep avoiding it, and I hate to say it, but maybe there is a need for a study with a robust community engagement about what we need to do there, which has never been done. And I mean, I don't know if there's been a robust community engagement about the bridge capacity issue.
I mean, the last one we did, the ecological study, was very robust, and we had a 15-member panel that met over a period of almost a year.
So what year was that? 2 years ago?
I mean, it was finished right after the adoption of the long-range plan. Because we didn't include it in the long-range plan because we didn't know what the solution was.
But there has been a lot more understanding of the value of public transit. There's a bigger push for multimodal, and there is a lot more redevelopment going on in Pantops.
And we considered those were we considered transit. We had a lot of discussions about transit-only bridges.
So you're advocating for the capacity evaluation.
Connections. And a lot of those things were discussed through the different scenarios in that study, through the committee and through public meetings that we had through the community. And we ended up with just improvements along the 250 corridor. Was the
consensus option.
It was consensus. We didn't have unanimous agreement with that concrete solution. So I mean, we've studied this location, this area several times, probably 4 or 5 times, and we haven't really come to unanimous consensus on any of the solutions. And this was the latest one in the history of the area.
That being said, we do have some good processes that have occurred in the near term that we could look to. For example, in the Route 29 panel and the hydraulic panel as models that, if there was an opportunity here to do it as a study, that we could look to those as templates for how to do a study with robust engagement and working towards a solution that kind of meets all needs.
And that looked at, growth trends and impacts.
Yeah.
This is an area, River Road is a potential small area planning area, for example. It's never been looked at holistically as a land use transportation study. I mean, we have been enlightened to some degree. Hydraulic was a very big example of that, where you're looking at it together. So I'm starting to understand the value of this capacity evaluation, and as opposed to thinking it's just kicking something down the road, but it's elevating that discussion, actually, as I understand it. They're putting it in scenario F.
I have a weird question about this. So if it's a capacity evaluation, so it's a study, it's not an actual project.
There would be no project for us to evaluate in terms of the measures, but that doesn't necessarily preclude it.
Right.
It would just be listed in the constrained plan as a study.
Okay.
So the dollars would change.
The dollars would change,
down to
yes.
$1 million or something.
Yeah, we would look to other processes to determine an appropriate cost.
Okay.
And that's very similar to what is being suggested for T1, which is express bus on Route 29 corridor. That's identified as kind of 1.5 million to study it, because even in order to get costs for something like that, we would need to have an understanding of stop locations, park and ride capacities, busways, if there were busways, stops, and all of that, and that's just not information that we have at the moment to even develop a conceptual cost estimate for that project.
So that's the same
Same
argument
same
for the
argument,
free bridge area
exactly.
capacity.
Yes.
Okay, so this is actually much more technical.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I'm willing to keep it as it is then,
So,
just to keep it up
so
there.
in scenario F, should we drop it down to a cost that is not reflective of building a project, but a cost that's reflective of a study? We'll get the numbers for the hydraulic study and use that to inform R20. So R20 becomes essentially, as it's listed there, a study, an evaluation, and not.
So that means it wouldn't become a project for another 6 years?
The LRTP can be amended at any time. So
you could add that to the LRTP?
Yes, it could. For example, it could be any of the projects in the visioning list could be moved to the constrained list if there's dollars available and by action of the policy board.
So is it possible to keep the two that you've removed on the visioning list as well as do the study?
Absolutely.
So we don't remove it?
No, it's not gonna die, that's.
Well, the removed project suggests to me that it's
Yeah,
not.
No, the top right up there.
Yeah, but
I know,
under
you see,
here they
it's
have
only to get removed again.
this scenario. The suggestion was to replace R20 with those, but they could easily be moved into the visioning list.
I would have comfort if those still remain in the visioning list as we're doing this intense technical study.
Okay.
Because I do see the value of really getting to the bottom of which makes the most sense relative to land use changes and demographic trends.
Yeah, that is entirely doable. We'd be happy to modify scenario round 3 accordingly.
The other thing I like with that is if you're putting a dollar estimate with your proposed construction project, you're kind of telling the planning group too, here are some parameters. They aren't hard and fast, but if we're estimating a $40 million project, designing or coming up with an $80 million project is probably not going to go well.
Right.
So I think it starts to define their scope a little bit too.
Yeah.
Well, while we're moving things, for the next scenario run, I would like to have Eastern Avenue put back in. Because it is capacity, it's bike and ped, it's safety, a whole lot of different elements on your bars that
Absolutely.
connect.
Yeah.
Decision, 10 years of land use decisions, this is based upon that connection being made. And since the proffers are now gone, thanks to the legislature, we need to move another way.
And so just so I understand, the free bridge one that we do have under scenario F, that 40.2 number is gonna change radically to reflect the study
Yeah.
rather than a roadway.
Correct. It would probably be less than $1 million, less than $2 million or something like that.
So then that allows for you to sneak Eastern Avenue.
Put it back.
I mean, keep in mind, none of this is constrained.
This is not constrained yet.
For the record, it does allow for us to modify the LRTP within the next cycle based on that study. And we've kept those two projects on the visioning list, so it's reinforced as being something that's still a priority on some level in this region.
Well, in the past, those kinds of changes have been made at any time. Like 2 months' notice, basically, to get it on the agenda. So it was not something I really wanted to have happen when it was back on last time. It has happened, and we can certainly do it again to things that become beneficial.
So am I hearing agreement to tell staff to move forward with scenario F kind of as the modifications suggested?
Maybe for the record too, Wood and I had a conversation and ran through these with MPO policy member Mr. Signer, who couldn't be here tonight. And so in running through, he was in agreement with the scenario D, which had the Hillsdale Drive and a lot of those in scenario F. one of the reasonings that he liked, not only was it because of the multimodal nature of a lot of those projects, but also with the thought that these are some smaller projects which would have a higher likelihood of getting funded, and with more smaller projects, a higher likelihood that we can get one or two of those that would make a difference than having to wait longer to get a higher cost project. And so, he was supportive of those from scenario D that are now in scenario F. But
So he wasn't changing the position of those, he was recommending that Hillsdale go to another scenario?
No. He was, what we were reviewing with him was D, and those items are now in F.
Okay.
Yes.
One point about the visioning list, and Chuck, correct me if I'm wrong, if there are smaller projects that might be a project that a locality would pursue in the safety category, or the district fund category of smart scale, being on the visioning list is all that is needed for those projects to, those localities to submit a smart scale application for that project. So one thing that's important to note there is that we will be reaching out to city and county staff to ensure that projects that are in the comprehensive plan, in CIPs, in city and county priorities are included in that visioning list, so they are able to.
Okay, so great. So that says is hypothetically, if you get a study on R20 that comes out really strong as advocating one way or the other, public support, everything, the whole 9 yards, you could go ahead and put in a smart scale application for that project because it's on the vision list as well.
Correct. As the smart
either
scale.
One of those.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, what's slightly different than the 2040 plan is smart scale, which is, it is essentially a second bite at the apple. These projects, once they're in this list, they're not done. They're not like these are the projects that are going to happen. Each of these projects, no matter where it is, still needs to be applied for. It still requires resolution from the local governing bodies, resolutions from the MPO, and all of that. So just to clarify, basically if it's on the list, it doesn't mean it's going to get built. It means it may get built.
It looks as if really we're rerunning D with our 20 coming out and our 13 going in, but there are those, if we only do F, we're losing a lot of the little sidewalk projects as Mike's message indicated. So maybe you could do both of those and see what if there is a difference that I'm just missing.
And again, it's not
looking at this chart, it looks like there's just a bunch that.
And it's not
The table on page 36 shows those relationships very well. You can go to that.
Attachment C,
the gridded chart, attachment C scenario summary. And keep in mind that we will have to fiscally constrain, so that is kind of the big goalpost in all of this is we will not be able to include all projects on the fiscally constrained list because there is just not enough anticipated funding.
But after January, we may know that there's some replacement.
We may know. And I have a handout that I can pass out that gives an idea of how much we would be deficient if we try to fund all of scenario 3 as was presented earlier. Yeah. And we're talking probably about $175 million gap between funding and projects.
Because we're supposed to use the 126 available
Yes,
on here, but that doesn't include the other buckets that you mentioned in the pie chart.
correct.
So we can be a little optimistic that there's some extra we can pull off of those.
Yeah, because that is only based on past performance.
But probably not as high as 300 million.
We do know that VDOT is indicating that they are shifting, in their funding forecast, there's a shift between building new projects and maintenance. With maintenance over time receiving greater funding support. But we are looking at a decrease in funding compared to what we saw in 2040. So
The point you were making is that that's the round of the first cut of the smart scale projects at the end of January, when you refer to January.
Yes, those first four that might get money from elsewhere that will then put some more
And
into
that
the
will
pot.
allow us to shift.
But that's the maybe, for sure.
Yeah.
Having it on there is better than not having it on there. That's my view.
And typically, the staff recommendation comes out at the January CTB meeting, and that's where the first public.
So with consensus on the structure of scenario F, staff will move forward with that analysis and present the results and continue to compare those to the previous scenarios. So that will be what's teed up for our next meeting, our next discussion.
Do you want to say exactly what changed or what's agreed upon the change? So R5 and R19 that are currently showing in removed projects will be moved to the visioning list compared to what's currently on the screen. And the amount for the R20 Free Bridge area study will be reduced to an amount that we will determine, but somewhere that it would be for the study itself,
correct,
not for the actual implementation of the infrastructure. And Eastern Avenue would be moved from the visioning list to scenario F. Those are the things I heard changed. Is that fair?
And then later we can figure out if there are other smaller multimodal things that we can shift over.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Because you've already tested those in D, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
And just to confirm, so go back a second. So the Free Bridge widening and the South Pantops Drive Bridge, those as standalone projects will be absorbed into the study. Meaning you're going to study those two types of projects in addition to this third multi-ped and transit improvement. It will be a capacity study that will also analyze those two projects.
I think they would start with an analysis of those two concepts, and
I just don't want to lose with them going to the visioning list and then that item over there. Those three projects are really tied to that one item and keeping the plot and money open for whichever scenario is determined. Can you do that? Just hold it open for whatever the outcome of that project is?
We haven't gotten to the constrained part of this yet.
Well, but I mean, if we're thinking about constraining, I mean, that's an important area, obviously, so that's one that we have to get to. Keeping that as a placeholder might need to be on the constraint.
I mean, I think it might need to wait for another cycle just because it's going to take a while to get the community study and all that support built for it. So, we'll see.
additional.
If I'm not, I think this is relevant. One thing too is there are only 2 funding cycles before we have to update this again. So there aren't a lot of opportunities to request money until we have to go through this process. With a 5-year plan,
So that's
there's only 2 smart scale rounds between now and then.
right. Well.
But remember, this is a 20-year plan.
Yeah.
Well, we need to talk ship again about how can we get a team like we got for hydraulic for the Pantops.
Yeah.
Which would be another one that would absolutely require county and city representatives at the table.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so similar.
It is.
It needs to have that level of intense expertise brought to bear and engagement, and and city-county cooperation.
Not, I mean, everything, which you said too, but the community, I mean, business,
Oh, yeah, the community,
environmental,
yeah,
civic engagement.
Neighborhood associations.
absolute community.
We had that last time, I mean, with Frank.
Oh, for Free Bridge?
For Free Bridge, he was the facilitator.
Yeah.
But we didn't,
It was not
but it
technically
didn't have the
oriented,
technical
though.
side
It was
that-
all
We
very
didn't have
simple.
all
There's
the
hydraulic
stuff,
side.
Stuff,
Yeah.
didn't have very much.
The technical team on hydraulic was, it was just phenomenal.
Yes.
And then with the urban design land use component, it was phenomenal.
So to accomplish that, what sort of funding needs to be found from where? What's the answer to that question? How quickly can we jump on that?
Well, that's what we needed, but that's a lot better than 40.2.
Okay, so that's what you're putting in, is
Yeah,
the
yeah.
1.5 or something.
So we can
for
do
that.
something as good as we did,
Okay.
because that's a,
Very good.
But I think to Ned's point, I'm sure what they'll do is assess all the work that's been done to date as the first
Yeah.
step in that
Oh,
process.
absolutely.
So
They should.
we're not losing those pieces,
Right.
we're building upon them.
and those new understandings of transportation, than just 4 years ago.
So back in the files, I think longingly of 2002, there, Chuck will remember, there was a lovely large slow-speed roundabout at 20 and 250 before all those buildings were close in there, and it would have solved all our problems, but they never got built. It would have kept everybody moving, but anyway. It's a dream from the old days. We've made a lot of progress today. I hope that you feel as if you've gotten some answers that are helpful.
I think we've gotten a lot
We
of really
certainly
good
got a lot of
direction.
answers from you, which is good. Other discussion on this item on our agenda? Are you ready to move on? Yes. There is
Just kind of reiterate our next steps, analyze round 3, continue discussion on constrained amount with VDOT, collect additional projects for visioning list from city and county, review VDOT crash data and STARS data to identify intersections, estimate costs for safety and intersection treatments. I believe last time we had 3 or 4 identified intersection projects, and then a category, a bin that was identified for general intersection improvements, and it's probably the same technique that we will use this time around. Update bridge list, looking at the bridges that are receiving the lowest scores in terms of being in poorest condition. And then finally integrate the bike ped project recommendations into the bike ped portion of the long range transportation plan. And that kind of tees up the next piece of the agenda.
I have one more question. So looking at how the picture handed out about the constrained funding.
Sure.
Studies are not eligible or should not be included when it's set the funding, right? So is it confusing when we see this list in the scenario that if you have the study there, it's not gonna be something that's in the constrained list as a study? That right now where it was originally proposed, it was as the improvements that were like the South Pantops and the Free Bridge. So, because studies are not eligible under the funding.
So they're not eligible for smart scale. It would be, it is an eligible expense. I think I was reviewing our last plan and we had identified the hydraulic areas for PE only.
Okay.
Well, if
It
you
might-
constrain, you have to reduce it down so you can identify what you're gonna do to print the study, which you got that information. You can use it.
Alright. Good question. Thank you.
I'm sorry, so what was the answer?
It's a study can be submitted.
Not the smart scale, but as
No, it's
for the constraint.
As a planning project.
Okay.
Alright. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the bicycle and pedestrian plan, the Jefferson area bike and pedestrian plan. Which you saw in your packet. There are a number of pages indicated or included in there. So the goal for this meeting is to look over the items that we've indicated in these pages that will be included in the bicycle and pedestrian plan. So this is something we've given you some updates on over the past few meetings. Know some of you have attended the public open house and other events we've had, or other events that have been held related to this. So yeah, at this point, we're looking to get your feedback on what is included in the plan and yeah, ensure that the things that are there make sense and get any feedback that you have. So the vision of this plan, and it is an update to a 2004, a plan that was adopted in 2004 for the entire Thomas Jefferson Planning District region, including the MPO. So the vision of this plan is to bring together multiple planning efforts and provide a guide for implementation on a regional scale. So go to the next one. You can see there are 3 different sections here. The first is an introduction. The second section is kind of the core part of the urban plan, the recommendations for the urban area, so that will be our focus of our discussion today. And then finally, the section 3 will be the rural plan. I will note right here, section 3 will have a few recommendations that are in the MPO area. We're splitting it mostly between section 2 and 3 based on Albemarle County's development areas. So as I'm sure you know, there are a number of areas within the MPO boundary that are part of Albemarle County's rural areas. But nonetheless, you know, the primary things that you will probably be interested in will be section 2, the urban plan. So yeah, go to the next slide. So section 1, there were just a few pages included here for you to review, kind of the general understanding of what we'll be including, the purpose and summary of the document, benefits, the wide variety of benefits associated with bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure for transportation and for the other benefits that come from that, and then national trends. So yeah, this section, all 3 chapters will provide an overview of the plan, context of the plan, information about the benefits, and relevant national trends. So yeah, we've provided a very minimal amount. We're still beginning to, you know, figure out everything that should be included in this section. So if you have any questions on the section as a whole, be willing to address those, but as I noted, really section 2, the urban areas, is where I'd be glad to talk in more depth. Okay, we'll move on to section 2. So there are 5 chapters that are a part of this. Chapter 4, and we have a separate slide on each of these, so I'll be going into a little more depth, but in general, it provides kind of the outreach and the overview of the work that was done in the urban areas, explanation or maps about the existing conditions, existing infrastructure, and stakeholders who are involved. Then the plans that the city and county has approved for regarding bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in the region. Then looking at regional corridors and prioritization of those regional corridors. And finally, looking at various implementation strategies to ensure that this network gets built and maintain momentum for building this in the region. So yeah, looking at each chapter, one at a time here. So chapter 4 will include the public outreach, the significant public engagement that has been done, and the impact of that on the planning process. So as you should be aware, the Charlottesville Area Community Foundation provided a grant to PEC, Piedmont Environmental Council, and TJPDC to do significant public outreach related to this plan and related to bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in the region. So that will be, a description of that will be included in this chapter. It is not in there currently. And then there will be the information that is in there showing there currently regarding the overview of the process to create the plan and the next chapters there. Moving on to chapter 5. So this will show, as is included there currently, the existing bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And then it will also provide some other relevant data regarding population and employment density, bicycle and pedestrian crashes, and some other information that's helpful to understand the context of bicycle and pedestrian current conditions for those using bicycle and pedestrian transportation or for other reasons in the region. Yeah, are there any questions on each of these? Open to any input. Don't mean to run through it too fast.
Whatever happened to the report, the assessment of the Route 76 as far as the sort of mile by mile study that was done several years ago about where the traps were and the places where the shoulder disappeared and things like that? Is that on a shelf somewhere? And what's happening with that?
I'm not willing to speak to the implementation of it, but it's a very thorough study, so it will be referenced as, you know, something to look at for the detailed recommendations for that area in here.
Okay.
So yeah, that will be, you know, directed.
So are you suggesting any rerouting or not? Because that would be something the community would have to be involved in. I don't want that to happen without that. Okay.
Correct, yeah.
There's no
It needs to happen, but it needs to happen with the process. Okay.
And actually back on chapter 5, one thing I'll say is that you may have noticed the maps that were provided are fairly vague as far as what's being shown for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. So an important piece going forward from this plan is getting the city and county and UVA and the important stakeholders working together to have that data shared, both online and in ways that you can open one map. We've tended to refer to this as the one map project, and see where the existing infrastructure is in the city and in the county on the same map. And not just existing infrastructure, but also the plans, the proposed facilities throughout the region. So that's one thing that will be referred to here and talked about more in the implementation chapter, is the importance of that integration and working together in the region to get this information.
Continued cooperation.
Right.
Pedestrian planning.
Yeah, be available both for planning purposes, but also for the general public.
It would be very cool in the light of the map in chapter 5 if you could change the little icons for Route 76 from a bus to a bicycle.
Okay, will do.
Because I was very confused when I'm looking at it going, is that a bus route? No, that's not a bus route.
Is there other dollar amounts put in here, like for making the improvements?
That's a good question. There will need to be, at least as this relates to the LRTP, because of course some of the projects coming out of this will go into the LRTP, and it's also something that can be done, you know, in order to make it more feasible or to provide information about implementation. They will likely be sort of planning level, you know, what's the distance of the project? So how much would that cost? And, you know, estimates about right of way, but not super specific. So it's not going to say, you know, this project for this 1 mile will cost exactly this amount of money. But we can come up with it will cost approximately this amount of money, give or take, you know, a notable margin. Yeah, give or take a notable margin. So, yeah, I mean, that's something we're open to feedback on too. Is that something that you think would be particularly helpful to have, you know, even if it's...
Because at some point, maybe, not in my lifetime, but it might be that they become a significant piece in the local CIPs. Right now, we're totally dependent on very piecemeal approaches to implementing the bike ped infrastructure. And if there is a unified vision with all 3 parties contributing within their CIPs for priority projects that they've all agreed to, they actually might get built. And I'm hoping that's the kind of the goal for this, that you can align. And I'm sorry if you did this already, but is there a priority system in place for this? Prioritizing?
That's chapter 7, 8. So yes, we're getting there. So chapter 6 will be the locality approved plans, along with UVA. So the City of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, UVA, also the MPO, have approved many plans that propose bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure for the region. So that's been a obviously very valuable input. And the main thing that we've looked at as we're creating this regional plan is what has been proposed by the city and county, what are in their plans. And so in Chapter 6, we provide maps with information about the type of infrastructure and what plan that's coming from. Are there any questions about how that's presented there? Or anything that would be more helpful in that chapter?
Well, I wonder if that could be the chapter that also talks about cost and how it needs to be, again, if all three parties, county, city, UVA, are funding a segment of a regional network, that whole regional network might get built. I mean, how? I'm just thinking if there's a piece of the regional plan that has elements in each of those parties, or the county and the city, if they see that together, funding them together at the same time would actually make that project happen. Right now, we don't see that.
Yeah, and you'll see in the last chapter in this section is implementation. And we are, showing some specific areas where it's particularly important that the city and county work together. And also, that's a good piece of feedback there. I mean, maybe for the whole network, or maybe in certain areas, it would be good to have costs and say, an estimate of county costs to build this area.
The estimate of the city costs to build this, and to get in their CIPs at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think this plan will really prioritize those joint areas. It's not trying to supersede and say a priority here jumps ahead of what the city of Charlottesville has in their own bike plan. But what this one does says is for this plan, the priority projects are those that are joint.
Yes.
And therefore, here's the dollar value and how they could be shared. Yes.
So yeah, looking at Chapter 7, which is identifying the regional corridors and then prioritizing them. Actually, two different slides on this one. First, looking at identifying these corridors. So this plan, and copied some text right out of the plan, this plan seeks to encourage creation of a regional bicycle and pedestrian network that is complemented by local bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in the city and county. So the regional network that you see in Chapter 7 obviously does not include every single bike lane or piece of infrastructure that is being proposed by the region as a whole. But these are the important corridors for regional connectivity. So the network shown provides interconnected infrastructure that provides route options that would allow for safe and convenient bicycle and pedestrian transportation throughout the region. So connecting to local sidewalks and bike lanes and shared use paths that would, be the first and last mile or piece that people would use to get to and from their homes or businesses and so on. So these corridors, the regional corridors, are consistent with local plans and were created in coordination with local government staff and using public input. And then looking at the prioritization part of Chapter 7, the initial prioritization was done with the Active Trans Prioritization tool. This I mentioned in the past and indicated some of the pieces that were used, some of the aspects that were used for that prioritization. And it was then adjusted using information based on existing efforts by the city and county, areas with parallel corridors. There were some adjustments made to prioritization for that region. Public support from our open house and the work that PEC, the outreach that they have done, and then also major costs or benefits that weren't included in the Active Trans Priority Tool evaluation. And one note about this is that this final prioritization, which is currently shown on page 51, right next to the regional corridors that I was just referencing on page 50, this is primarily related to the transportation benefits of the infrastructure. So there certainly could be reasons that the city or county or whatever funder of these projects will look at a tier 3 project on this map, so tier 3 being the lowest tier of what we're identifying as having, transportation benefits, but they'll see other benefits for that project that will make it a better candidate or a more likely project to be funded in the near term. But in general, the prioritization shown again on page 51 is meant to provide some structure and say, tier 1 projects deserve extra effort, and these are the places where, as we noted, the city and county should be particularly looking to make sure they're working together. And as I noted, a couple specific places are called out in chapter 8. So yeah, is there any feedback on either the corridors that were identified or the prioritization, or just how that's in general presented in chapter 7?
Did you look, I know that this focuses heavily on Charlottesville, Alabama, but when you start thinking of, I'm thinking specific of bikers who want to really move even larger than our region through it, do you tend to look at our connected points to those type of numbers?
So yes, the rural areas, part of the plan, that's what you're referring to, yeah, kind of the connectivity out. Yes, that will connect in with this. I think we're currently showing a shared use path going all the way to Ruckersville and then potentially connecting to the park up there into Standardsville. I don't know if there are other places you just specifically have in mind, but yeah, some of the James River Trail is a regional long-term possible effort. So, and then a lot of the rural areas will be more on-road or likely more recreational in nature routes. But yes, we're also looking to show that connectivity.
Just to follow up a little bit on that, in terms of the prioritization, we talk about a new shared use path with the 10 points. Is there any benefit or additional points, or if that new shared use path is providing additional connectivity to an existing, or, for example, once you stop a new one out in the middle of nowhere versus fills in a gap, the one that fills in the gap would be far more valuable than just one in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of ways that was looked at, or somewhat accounted for. One of those is the demand analysis, where we use the streetlight data tool that we mentioned earlier, which looks at an existing number of travelers by any mode, and we're looking at the number of those trips that are less than 5 miles. So that's not specifically the connectivity piece you're talking about, but it's saying if a corridor is built, say along or parallel to US 29, then it would get a higher score for travelers versus, so that's along US 29 in the urban area, it would get a higher score for travelers versus, say, the piece that's along US 29 north of Hollymead, or even further out of the urban area, would get a lower score for that. As far as connection to existing infrastructure, that's something that was looked at in discussions with staff to make sure that kind of the corridors shown make sense, and I think that might have been a reason for a few projects, but in most cases, those are the projects that are already city and county efforts, those key pieces to connect with existing infrastructure. Yep. Okay. So this is implementation strategies, is the final chapter.
I'm sorry, can you go back? So the connectivity, and you may have just answered this, but again, under the prioritization, you got it at the city-county boundary, and then addresses major barrier, and then the hubs. And that's the piece where I was looking at your the destinations, like number of schools, parks, etc., along the project route. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking of those areas, like in the county, where you say Hollymead to down to where Polo Ground Road is. And we've already got a multi-use path in there. But I started thinking about the destinations along that. I guess what you're saying is that the volume would have made that project high because of the amount of people that would have been trying to get from Hollymead down to Polo Ground Road to continue on into the city.
Right.
Whereas there's not really any destinations for them along between polo grounds and Hollymead. But that would be a major connectivity from a hub, Hollymead, to another hub, which would be the Rio 29 area, essentially.
Well, and under connectivity, the term or junction or hub was actually just kind of what John was asking about, where places where a lot of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, either existing or future, comes together. So that's actually what hub means in that context, not like an economic development hub or a density hub. But yes, as far as the specific location where you're talking about, it might not get any points for destinations, but yeah, then it could have, get extra points for the demand measure specifically.
So make sure if there's any places, like before we put that multimodal, or that shared use path in along 29, you don't have bike and pedestrian activity. And then when it's there, lo and behold, here it comes. And now we're got all these little small places that are south of it, that's a continuation of it. People say, well, can you fill these gaps in and get us into the city? But that big project was done as part of the transport, understood the 29 improvements. But if we were looking at another type of corridor that would connect a lot of pedestrian and more bike specific to get to other places in the region, I want to make sure the criteria allows for that. It says, okay, just because there's not destinations along it, it would be connecting to population high points or something.
Yeah, and that was the reason why we wanted to make sure that this demand piece was included, so that there would be, a method for increasing the priority of a project exactly like that, where it may not have destinations or even people living right near it, but where it provides kind of that regional connectivity. Great, so chapter 8, there are a number of pieces included there too, as far as implementation strategies. And just kind of broadly, we already referenced the importance of coordination between the city and county and UVA, and so some of the places that were specifically, that you can see in the document, the initial places we've indicated here, and there certainly can be more, are the 5th Street Hub, where there's already been good coordination with the city and county and TJPDC coordinating that. Also the hydraulic and 29 area, again, a place where there's really important, really a high demand for bicycle and pedestrian connectivity in that area. And so the plan with the pending applications for smart scale funding, and then if those aren't, approved, kind of working forward on how best to do that, to provide pedestrian and bicycle connections in that area. Then the third one listed here are kind of the connections across I-64 in the Charlottesville-Albemarle boundary. So looking at the Avon Street corridor and also Old Lynchburg, Sunset Avenue, and 5th Street. Not only right where they cross I-64, but making sure there's kind of larger corridors that provide bicycle and pedestrian connectivity through there. And then also Route 20 and a potential underpass connection to Route 53 at the Saunders-Monticello Trail. Saunders-Monticello Trail. So if there are any questions about any of these specifically, feel free to speak up. And then just a few others that are, again, currently included in the plan, looking at kind of the larger along the Ravenna River, and near there, including Carlton Avenue, Broadway Street, and a bridge over the Ravenna River. That corridor in the Belmont and Belmont-Carlton, Woolen Mills area. And then there has been talk of a number of different, connections over the Ravenna River. One down there to Pantops, certainly, the Free Bridge discussion that we had. And then also from Darden Town Park to Penn Park, possibility of a bridge there, something that has come up. And finally, looking over near UVA, the need for crossings of the bypass, improved infrastructure at Fontaine Avenue and Ivy Road. Fontaine, of course, is a current smart scale application, the interchange with the bypass. And then some other projects over near University Hall and John Paul Jones Arena. So yeah, these are the current areas that have been identified as important for multiple stakeholders, city, county, in some cases UVA to be involved with. Are there any other locations that any of you are thinking of immediately that should be called out in this plan as important connections? There may, in working with staff, be other places come up. This isn't meant to be a final list, but
you've already included connections to parks and things that are existing or future. I saw that line drive down to Biscuit Run, which is
yeah.
And I think the value of the plan is also that it makes the bike connections also an alternative commuting route. It's not only recreational anymore, and that comes across.
Focus is very much on it is a transportation.
It's a transportation piece.
And the other thing that Kathy you brought up before that could be included in this would be some sense of cost.
Yes.
I don't know if that would make sense kind of within each of these to add costs, but yeah, that's something we can definitely think about.
Right.
How best to include that in a way that would encourage implementation.
Right. I mean, again, to make it compelling for the local jurisdictions to put serious dollars into their CIP, if they could see it adding up to a regional transportation corridor. And is there any effort at all? I know this is perennially difficult to understand mode shift, like how many people that would be in a car are actually using the bike ped melting these corridors.
That's not something that we're studying in this plan. That's something we can indicate as a next step as far as.
I mean, I would, I mean, only because that just helps to.
Yeah.
And it's the same argument for transit. I mean, it just helps when you're trying to make local investments because the state money is not there. Demonstrating another use value.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, we do know from our Streets at Work efforts that 12% of our commuters are walkers. That's in the census information. So cross-tabulating with census data and doing the counting and putting in place these elements that can set us up for measuring this later on.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think the census information will probably be put under existing conditions as far as some of that background for current conditions. But yeah, that's a really good point.
Did you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, the list, I just want to very quickly add to the list that you made. And I think the pedestrian and bicycle connectivity across railroad tracks, whether it's in the Belmont area between downtown and Carlton Road, or whether it's near the Rothery Road, UVA parking garage, over towards U-Haul or whatever it's going to replace U-Haul, and whether it's out where the RTF trail crosses the railroad tracks pretty near the bypass, that those need to be a point of strong emphasis. I need to go in a couple of minutes.
Thank you.
If I can throw that in. I also participated in the very, very robust community engagement of the previous proposal for Free Bridge. I believe Chuck was there, I believe Chip was there, I know Kathy was there. Burning Moran auditorium was at least half full, if not 2/3 full. And I'm a member of the Martha Jefferson Neighborhood Association, and I know the Locust Grove Neighborhood Association, the Martha Jefferson Neighborhood Association, the North Downtown Neighborhood Association. I think you could count them as, if not 100%, then 99.44, since we're so pure, opposed to widening the bypass between Freebridge and Locust, which was the previous plan. I believe it was approved with the consent of city councilors who had just come on board in Rio and were aware of the community's doubts about that. So if you go back to perhaps some of those transcripts and some of those, it was recorded, I believe, back to that as an integral part of your study of that project. I think you'll get a great deal of benefit. For instance, the discussion of a parallel bridge, having another bridge over the Rio Grande, for whether it's just bike ped or buses, whatever that was brought up there. I think to some extent the expansion of River Road, maybe not as much as the city now, and it was all brought up. And the whole idea was that, hey, you just have to improve the intersections. You don't have to pave more of paradise because that was like wildfires.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll wrap up with the bike ped plan here quickly. So yeah, as far as funding goes, there's some of that identified in this implementation part of the chapter, and then just some other additional pieces that will help encourage implementation of this plan. So as far as our broader next steps, we're continuing to identify things that should go in this chapter 8, implementation strategies, and locations where the city-county coordination is essential, and UVA coordination is essential for implementation. So the goal is to have a complete draft document in January to bring to you for your consideration in January, and also to the TJPD Commission in early 2019. And then along with the document itself, we're working with PEC to ensure that pieces of the document and deliverables are valuable for encouraging implementation. So any final questions on anything related to the bike ped?
I think we worked it out. Thanks. Excellent. Very good. So next on our agenda is staff reports, tip adjustments, obligations, and all.
Sure, I'll take us through this very quickly.
Okay.
For the month of October, we had 2 tip adjustments. One was Emmett Street streetscaping project, and it was a Garvey debt service adjustment. If there are specific questions, I would direct those to Chuck. We also had a maintenance maintenance bridges grouping that had a slight adjustment there. Both did not reach the level of the tip modifications, so they were just performed as administrative adjustments. There's no questions, I'll jump to annual obligation report, which is a continuation essentially of our tip discussion. This is an annual listing of federal funds which were obligated during the federal fiscal year 2018. It's provided to the MPO within 90 days of the end of the federal fiscal year, and is included in Virginia's annual obligation report provided to FHWA. It's basically an accounting of what federal funds have been obligated to what projects that are currently in the TIP. And it's just them letting us know where the money is being directed currently. I do have a resolution basically saying that we've seen it and received the document for the MPO to consider, but it's really just an administrative housekeeping item. Anything you would like to add? Chuck?
We just have to provide it to the MPO by December 1st.
Okay, this is the annual obligation report.
One other staff item, if you don't have any questions on that, because I'm sure that you will be hearing that similar to last year, Senator Peake has pre-filed a joint resolution that requests VDOT to study the feasibility of an eastern bypass for US Route 29 around Charlottesville.
I know.
We are somewhat assured, that may be a little bit stronger word, but this has very high likelihood of following the same death that his B-file bill last year took, was it never got out of committee. But just so you know, David Blunt is following this closely, and should it seem to take a different path, we will let you know, both as the NPO and your localities. But I'm sure you'll be hearing about it, and we wanted to give you a heads up.
Thank you. It goes to Transportation Committee, I guess. Do we know who chairs that anymore?
You know, that information would be really helpful, knowing who is,
I guess they
who
probably
on
have
these
to.
transportation committees. You know, just
That'd be good.
even in general, there might be some other
Other
needs for us to take trips down there and talk to them.
LIS is the place to go. All right.
And we included the transit ridership report link in the packet.
We could just look at it ourselves.
Yeah, and that's basically just, yeah.